This is the final panel. I think we've lost a few people. Hopefully, someone online still, and we're going to record this, obviously. So, this is a artificial intelligence panel. So, we have three really great speakers. I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves, but we're going to kind of cover a definition at first, some regulatory issues, and then go into some use cases, and then hopefully have some time for some questions. So, I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves and their firm and what they do, and I'll start with Scott.
Thank you. My name's Scott Kosnoff. I'm with Faegre Drinker, the law firm. I chair the firm's AI practice. And I spend most of my time advising clients on the evolving regulatory expectations for use of AI and then helping them put together a governance and risk management framework that will mitigate their risk.
I'm Matthew Stewart. I'm the CTO of Harbor AI. We focus on processing and automating insurance transactions. So focused on underwriting, and so I finished my PhD 2 years ago and in AI, and now we're basically applying those methods in the underwriting framework.
I'm Sanjeev, founder CEO of GigaForce, and we do claims processing. Very specifically, we focus on subrogation salvage part of it, okay, and its connectivity with the reinsurance companies. But fundamentally, we've been building some models very specific to the claims part of it.
Great. So Matthew, I'm going to start with you, kind of a definition, if you would. I mean, I know everybody in this room is familiar with artificial intelligence, and I think there's probably some misconceptions, but given you have a PhD in it, I thought maybe you could be a really good person to kind of do a walkthrough. How do you define AI more broadly, and then we'll get into some other issues.
Sure, yeah, so I guess the simplest way I could describe it is it's a set of algorithms or methods that allow you to perform data-driven decision-making. So you can basically emulate the decision-making processes of a human, and that can be as narrow as like a very specific task or as general as everything a human could do. So you have AI is a very broad set of methods. It can include things like genetic algorithms, rule-based systems, literally if-then statements. Some people describe that as AI. And then it's often conflated with machine learning, which includes a bunch of methods, including things like linear regression, which most people wouldn't think normally as machine learning. And then you have deep learning, which is the same thing but with neural networks. And then you have generative AI, which is most people conflate with language models, but language models is a very specific use case of generative AI. It's basically anything that's creating data. And the flip side of that is discriminative methods. So the first types of AI were focused on discriminating, so basically putting things in different categories or boxes. And then now we've focused more on the creative side of generative AI. Yeah.
Good.
That's helpful.
No, it's good. So Scott, I'm going to turn to you to regulatory issues, given that you've kind of become one of the key leaders on regulatory issues around the NAIC in terms of issues. So a little free commercial for Scott, for any of you carriers. And I've known Scott for a long time. He didn't even pay me to say that. But so looking at the landscape that's going on around the regulatory issues with AI, NAIC, federal, kind of give us a quick lay of the land on what you're seeing out there. We got the bulletins going on. Iowa just, Commissioner Oman put out one recently. Where are things kind of landing? I know it's evolved quite a bit in the last 3 years, and you've really been a leader in that. So kind of give the audience kind of a lay of the land right now.
Thanks, Nick. So you were smart to ask for a definition of AI because it's a very contentious issue, right? I mean, there is no universally recognized definition, and the industry wishes the definition were more narrow. The regulators, I think, had one that was intentionally broad to cast a wider net. So, they're the ones that make the rules, and that's basically what we have to live with. As Nick indicated, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners adopted unanimously a model bulletin regarding insurers' use of AI back in December. So we're coming up on a year. 17 states have adopted the model bulletin in one form or another. Most of them haven't changed a word. Iowa just floated a version, a very slightly revised version of it in the last week. There will be other states that come on board too. It's anybody's guess how many states ultimately adopt it, but I would guess, probably 25 at the end of the day, something like that. At a very high level, the NAIC bulletin basically says if you're an insurer and you're using AI, you need to adopt a governance and risk management framework that's intended to mitigate the risks of consumer harm, and it encourages insurers to engage in testing, including with respect to unfair discrimination. It purports to take a non-prescriptive approach, meaning here are literally 10 pages of things that you should consider, but you've got to decide what makes sense for you given your organization's risk appetite, use cases, blah, blah, blah. We'll see how that plays out in practice. When it comes to the market conduct exam, it's conceivable that an examiner could treat the non-prescriptive bulletin essentially as a cookbook recipe and just go right down the list, but not today, right? Okay, so we've got 17 states that have adopted the thing already. Some states will not adopt it because, frankly, they don't see this as an issue. And they don't think AI is worth spilling ink on. Other states won't adopt it because they want to do something more prescriptive, more aggressive. And then other states will sort of do their own thing, and you can argue about whether it's more aggressive or not. One of the states that won't be adopting the bulletin is Colorado. You probably know that in 2021, Colorado adopted first of its kind legislation dealing with insurers' use of what they call ECDIS. That's external consumer data and information sources. They started with the life insurance industry in terms of implementing that statute. And anyway, if you're a life insurer, you know all about that. You're undoubtedly hard at work putting together your governance and risk management framework now. I mention Colorado in the same breath as the NAIC, even though the NAIC bulletin deals with AI and Colorado deals with ECDIS, because actually they have a whole lot more in common than you might think. And frankly, if you were putting together a framework that complied with the Colorado regulation, that would go a long way towards satisfying the NAIC bulletin. Another state that isn't going to adopt a bulletin is New York. They always go their own way. This summer, they put out a circular letter that in many ways sort of builds upon what's in the NAIC bulletin and builds upon concepts in the Colorado governance regulation, mushes them all together, and then sprinkles in a healthy dose of New York-specific onerous requirements that if you're doing business in New York, you're going to have to contend with, right? So New York is sort of the greatest hits collection, if you want to think of it that way, or the worst hits collection, depending on your perspective. And then we've got other states that will be doing their own thing, but that's sort of the lay of the land from a state insurance regulatory standpoint. At the federal level, of course, the Federal Insurance Office is not a regulator. It doesn't have any enforcement authority, but they're keenly interested in AI. So just a couple of weeks ago, this was so cool. I was included in a closed-door meeting at the Treasury Department to talk about the insurance industry's use of AI. And there were insurers and reinsurers and trade associations and academics, and it was really very interesting. But if you sort of distilled it down, Treasury wanted to hear how regulators and industry were using AI, what the upsides were, what the downside risks are, and what the use of AI might mean for access to insurance. That's kind of a recurring theme here. How is all this going to impact access to insurance? If you're using it as an insurer in other contexts, like in the HR context, you got to worry about what the EEOC and the Department of Labor have to say, because they're very concerned that the use of AI could unintentionally violate, like the Americans with Disabilities Act or other federal unfair discrimination laws. If you've got an investment management function, or I should say a broker-dealer function, you got to worry about the SEC, and now FINRA has put AI on their watch list of things to concern about. So given what all of us do for a living, I think it's easy to focus exclusively on the insurance piece, but it's not just about insurance.
So that's a lot. If you're a carrier, how would you stay abreast of all that?
It's hard, I have to tell you. I mean, it's nearly a full-time job. I spend minimum half hour every day just reading what happened in the last day and trying to stay up to speed. And sometimes it's an hour, depending on just what my inbox looks like. Not to be overly self-serving, because this will not make me any money, I can assure you. But if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I post about this stuff all the time, and that will save you.
He does a good job with that, so yes.
Yeah, that will save you a lot of time if you want to just piggyback off that. But there are emails that come out daily or weekly that will help fill that void.
So if you put a carrier hat on, out of all the things going on, what should they be thinking about to strengthen their regulatory compliance, but not necessarily stifling their ability to innovate or experiment? Because there is a balancing act there, obviously.
Yeah, and it's a tough one, and we hear about that tension all the time. So, I mean, I guess the good news is if you're in the risk management business already, and you undoubtedly are, which is why you're here, you don't have to go to some distant planet and come back with something wholly new and different for AI purposes. What you're doing with respect to AI ought to look and feel an awful lot like what you're already doing with your ERM program, and it ought to look and smell a lot like existing compliance efforts that you've been engaging in for years. It's just that this is going to be AI specific. Everybody wishes that we were at a point where there was a magic recipe that if only we followed it in the right order, we would be guaranteed not to get in trouble as a result of our use of AI. But that's not today, and it's probably not going to happen ever. So in the meantime, what I always tell our clients, and some of you have heard this, is you got to have a good story to tell. And by that, I mean you have to have a story that demonstrates credibly that you appreciate the concerns expressed about the use of AI, you're taking those concerns seriously, and you're acting with reasonable care to try to avoid negative outcomes. If you can put together that sort of good story, then have a party, throw a parade, whatever, because that's as well as we're going to do today. But it's easier said than done. It can't be done over a fun-filled 3-day weekend, and there's no finish line, because what looks and feels like a good story to tell today may not look so great a year from now, because the technology will keep evolving, the way we use it will keep evolving, the expectations will keep evolving, so it's something that you're going to have to keep revisiting. The only other thing I'd say on this front is that it's easy to get caught in the weeds on all this. It's easy to focus on all the components of the risk management framework, but take a step back and think about what we're trying to accomplish. What we're trying to do here is to institutionalize critical thinking. Rather than purchasing the latest model because it's shiny and new and it promises all kinds of amazing things, or rather than doing the same thing in-house, take a breath and pause and ask yourselves not only what could go well, but what could go not so well, meaning what could go wrong, who could be hurt, how bad would it be, how likely is it to occur, and what, if anything, can we do to put guardrails around it, either to prevent the bad thing from happening or to soften the impact if it were to happen. If you do that, if you institutionalize that sort of thinking, then you can engage in this sort of defensible weighing of costs and benefits. If you don't do that, I think everything is just sort of window dressing, and you're not going to get at the actual challenge.
So last question before we turn it on to sort of the experts on the field side of it. So if you think about, where regulation's going, I guess I'd like to know, where do you think it's going to go? And then do you think regulators are really up for the task of trying to put the right framework in place around artificial intelligence, again, while not stifling innovation and making U.S. companies even less competitive than other countries?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Regulators, for the most part, were not math majors. They're not data scientists.
Not PhDs like Matthew. No.
Right. I'm not those things either, right? These are public servants who are doing their best to try to protect the public from concerns and risks that have been identified, right? And I think in the insurance sector, for the most part, they've gotten it right, or pretty close to right. I like the focus on governance and risk management. I like when they say whatever you do ought to be risk-based, meaning focus on the big fish, don't worry too much about the small fish. I think where the regulators tend to get on thin ice is when they become too granular, too prescriptive, particularly in the area of testing. I think there's a real value to testing. I think companies are smart to do it, and frankly, I think it would be risky not to do it. But let's face it, testing is very new in this area, and there is no consensus yet on how it ought to be done. And even if there were a consensus on how to do it, there's no consensus on how to measure the results. We're going to get there, but we're not there today. And so for regulators to try to be too prescriptive on the testing front, I think can lead to a lot of wasted effort and ultimately madness.
Yeah, probably for sure some madness. Sanjeev, I'm going to go to you. We've known each other a long time. After we've set the baseline and definition, some regulatory guardrails, talk to the audience about how you've seen AI used in the insurance industry, how Gigaforce is kind of using it to further the industry, and maybe what's worked and what hasn't worked.
Sure. Okay. So before I go there, I just want to tell my introduction with Nick. He almost
It's a
put me
pretty good introduction.
Yeah. Yeah. You want to tell about that?
Well, I'll tell my version of it. So I'm at an event in California, Silicon Valley, and this guy gets up and does a good presentation, but what he was talking about was a little on the edge, I'll say.
Yeah.
So afterwards, I went up to him and said, "You can tell him what I said to you. I'll let you do that part."
So he asked me, who has implemented this? Okay. So I asked Nick, you can have a gun to shoot somebody or to protect. I'm not sure which side are you coming from. He said, what you did, this is from Wild Wild West. This is before the insurtech word was coined. He said, you guys from the west part of the world, you don't know what you're doing. This is a very regulatory area. Okay, and now I have to go after you. I have to go after the company, and I have to go after the carrier who has implemented that part of it. Okay, so anyway, that was his warning to me. He says, don't do anything stupid like that. Okay, next time you do it, talk to me first. So
And he did talk to me before we started Gigaforce.
yeah,
Anyway,
sure, thank you. And then he says, okay, I bless it. So okay, this is how it started there. Interesting. So the definitely one area among all the places where the AI is making a big influence is in the insurance space for sure. So very specifically where at a broader sense where the AI could be very positively used is the fraud part of it, okay, or where the service factor comes there, okay, like whether you the claim processing or even the policy distribution, okay, these are some of the places where insurance could be where the AI is being used in a very positive sense. There, I think probably somewhere somebody said right, the top 5 areas where AI will make a big significant difference is insurance. Okay, so I think that's what we really see. Now, your second question here is where are we using it from our perspective, right? So when the claim comes, right? So we know it's a seasonal part of it. When the hurricane season comes, right? Suddenly the claim goes up, and we do very specifically subrogation there. So there are only a few sets of claims which, irrespective of the volume, which you can go collect go after that and collect the money there. So this is one place where we have very high, strong predictability. We have seen it almost like up to 98.3% we can predict. The claim has a high potential, so go after it. Or the claim has no potential, so you can just ignore it. Or it's like, the Google spam, which the claim, which, sometimes you'll have a good email go into the spam, but most of the time it does a good job. So I think we definitely have achieved a proficiency as that part of it. Now, the other places is, the biggest activity takes place when you're making the demand packages, when you're making a reverse party. So that's another place where you train the model and then you can figure it out, how you can make the package there. The third thing, which is getting more and more popular off late, is the agent part of it. And I think if you're following this track, this is going to be a big phenomena, okay, at least at this point of time, where using an agent will do your job for you. Like what we tell Alexa, okay, go make this, buy this stuff for me. The same thing will happen in claims where you will have the agent doing a specific job. The scariest part is, if you go too far, agent can recruit another agent. I won't go there, probably it'll eventually come there because that can open another can of worms there. So that's places where we use today.
so Matthew, kind of same question to you. How is Harbor viewing these things, and what have you kind of worked on to push the industry? I know you've worked with a couple of very large carriers. Not sure if you can say their names, but I know you're working with some large carriers, so kind of the same question to you.
Yeah, so I would say I've only been in this space for like a year or so now, but I went into InsurTech Insights in New York a few months ago, and I sat at the tech stage. Obviously, no one knows me there, so I just sat at the tech stage and watched all of the startups come and present themselves. And I'm pretty sure maybe 90% of them were all just some kind of language model wrapper for like ChatGPT or these other kind of language model frameworks. So definitely, I think that's something I'm seeing a lot of. And now, like, some of the more mature companies are also developing those. I'm like kind of reluctant to go into that just because, I've worked a lot on like privacy interpretability of models, and it's extremely difficult to explain the decisions of a language model. And so if you start building out agentic frameworks like this, where you have language models talking to other language models and like controlling decisions, and they're doing it at like hierarchical levels, it gets extremely complicated. And I feel like from a regulatory perspective, it's probably very difficult to justify. So one area that we've been using it is you can actually use, so language models count as generative AI, you can actually use generative AI as a discriminative approach. So a good example of that is um, like abstraction of documents. So you can take PDFs and you can say classify it into one of these categories, for example. So let's the only example I can think of now is like classifying tweets. So at one point I remember I did an interview with OpenAI, and one of their sections was use GPT-3 to classify tweets from an airline into one of 3 categories, and it was like baggage claim issues, flight delays, that kind of thing. And you can just give it 1 or 2 examples, and then it can go and classify 10,000 tweets with, you know, near perfect accuracy, which is really impressive. And that approach, you can use discriminative methods to interpret the generative AI. So in that sense, it's much easier for you to play with it. But yeah, I can't go and explain to you why it's, like if you ask a language model why it made a certain decision, that is a new prompt. And so it's not going to be, it's going to like be post hoc rationalization of what it said. It's not a real explanation of its decisions. So that's one area that we're using it is as a discriminative approach. And then we also work with a rule-based system, which still counts as AI if you speak to some people, but we use an actual AI infrastructure to optimize our rule-based approach. So it's kind of like a bit of a workaround, I suppose, for the regulatory environment. But the rules that it creates out of it are still explainable. So I like to call it a regulatory-friendly inference pipeline.
Yeah,
I have a very quick cautionary tale building upon what Matthew just said about how it's hard to explain how the logical links are connected, and sometimes you got to take what ChatGPT tells you with a grain of salt. So a few months ago, I asked ChatGPT to compare and contrast the Colorado governance regulation for life insurers with the New York Circular. And of course, it spits out 3 really well-written and well-developed paragraphs, and I'm reading it, and I thought, wow, this is really good analysis. I'm impressed. And so I clicked on the quotation marks that show you what it's relying on. It was citing me. And I thought, that's not exactly, you know, talk about circular reasoning. It just shows you got to be careful. You can't just take it for granted.
I've actually had it cite papers of me that I didn't write. They don't exist. So
Even worse.
and you didn't get billed for it, did you? You should have collected some money on that deal. Sheesh. A lot's been written about job losses and things like that. I'm going to ask both you gentlemen. You know, if you think about the insurance industry, depending on what you read, 400,000 jobs are going to be open over the next decade, given retirements and things of that nature. How do you think AI could help a carrier, you know, either look at their workforce differently? Will it eliminate some jobs or more hybrid? Where do you see AI sort of helping in the human talent and maybe it's going to be hard to replace 400,000 people in the next decade. So, Sanjeev, I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Sure. No. One question here, right? The audience here, right? How many of you think your job will be lost by AI?
Anybody?
Okay. Let me ask the same question differently. Okay. How many of you know that some job will be lost using AI? If you could raise your hand. See, this is insurance, right? Okay. Where, you know, a hurricane is coming. It's not going to hit my house, but it's hit by my neighbor's house. Yeah. So anyway, I think the fact here is you're right. The numbers that has been forecasted in the insurance space, time and again, those numbers are coming. The only way you can, fill those gaps is using AI, the automation that we are able to do it. Okay. If I took a little bit broader sense here, World Economic says, right, there'll be 85 million job loss will happen because of AI. But on the contrary, they're saying 97 million jobs will be created because of AI. So it's the only question of, how you retrain yourself there. And, from the insurance company's perspective, I think it is important for them to adopt AI, but also there will be human interaction will always be required there. That you can't oversee that. You cannot interact there. And, probably that's my opinion here.
Matthew, you have any thoughts?
yeah, so I'd say if you could look at the tech industry as an example of this. So I think when most of the software engineers that were probably developing like language models, for example, never thought that, the language model would be able to code better than me within like 2 years. And now I don't know a single person who works at any big tech company, or even, in my company, who doesn't use language models to help them write their code. at least like GitHub Copilot or something like that. So yeah, I think it doesn't necessarily eliminate their jobs, but it makes them a lot more efficient in their processes. And that does just inherently mean that you need less people to do the same role. And if you extend that to like claims processing, underwriting, you might be incredibly efficient at doing that. If you can basically automate 80% of that workflow, you've eliminated 80% of those jobs, and you're still doing the same amount of deal flow. So yeah, and then there's also the aspect of unintended consequences. You might not necessarily be aware, like those software engineers, that your job could be next. And so when I see all these estimates, I'm like, take them with a grain of salt. You don't,
Yep.
they are just that. They're estimates.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get more granular on some use cases, maybe in your particular firms that you've actually done. Leveraging some of this technology. Maybe, like you said, maybe there was an unintended consequence that you kind of learned from that. But something that you've kind of like, whether it's an aha moment you've had in a client that you've actually said, well, damn, it actually works. Give us some couple concrete examples of a use case, and I'll start with you, Matthew.
Okay. Yeah, so we work with Berkeley. That's one of our biggest clients, and so we basically built a underwriting model for them and said, hey, this is what we built. Do you want to try and implement it? And then they came back to us and said, that's really interesting. Can you actually use it to train underwriters, and can you use it to compare the performance of different underwriters and rank them? And that is not something I'd initially expected them to to ask for. And yeah, so even if you're not using it to replace people, you can also use it to augment them and even train them. So that was kind of a surprise for me, I would say.
Yeah. So one of the things that I already mentioned, right? As part of the claim comes, and we can segregate the claims, or discriminate it based on the whether you use a rule-based engine and you use AI on top of it, and there's a machine learning part of it. We may think the claim may have a subro potential, but adjuster may think it otherwise, right? But we can train our model continuously. So that part has done very well there. The other thing is using the Gen AI part of it, right? So there's a lot of compliance thing happens. Okay, like the moment a claim comes, you have to send some letter or type of letter. Now you can ask, not exactly using ChatGPT, but making your own model. And there's a downside of using ChatGPT because the data goes out and none of the insurance company likes it. So we make our own models where we can generate the letter for you, and of course you edit that part of it eventually to your needs there. So couple of such cases are there, which we think is gelling very well with the audience there right now.
So my next question is really for all three of you, and I'll start with you, Scott. So, we talked about some risks, job loss and things like that. What are other risks that we're really not thinking about, and what are some things that you're thinking about? And then, is doing nothing actually a bigger risk? In other words, is doing nothing with this technology maybe even the biggest risk? So I'll start with you, Scott.
So on that job loss thing, I think that's a natural question, and it comes up all the time. I always tell people, look, AI is probably going to kill us anyway, so whether you have a job or not is sort of irrelevant. So we've heard from a variety of panels already today about reputational risk, and I think that's a big deal when you're talking about AI. And so what I like to tell our clients is, think about what would happen if the New York Times printed a front page story accurately reporting on how your organization is using AI. Would you feel proud, or would you feel squeamish? And that's a really good litmus test for just thinking about your use cases and what you've got on the drawing board. Litigation's another obvious concern too. There have been a number of high profile cases filed against organizations in the AI context, including among big insurers, so that's something to worry about. These, whether you're talking about regulatory risk or litigation risk or reputational risk, they tend to be related. If you wind up on the front page of the New York Times, you're going to get sued the next day anyway.
Yeah, I'd say probably one of the biggest risks is, certainly not using AI is, so thinking from a carrier perspective, they're fairly risk averse, so they don't tend not to go into these things unless they know it's going to be successful. And so I'll say they maybe don't have the incentive as well, because they could just come to a startup like us and say, well, if it works out for them, we'll just buy them, or something like that. So, yeah, I would say that's a particular risk. My mind's just gone blank. Do you want to go first and then come back?
Okay, I can go ahead. Yeah, so I'll tell a small old joke, whatever, right? Like if you ask a mathematician, right, what is 2 plus 2, just excuse me, I know it's a very old joke. I'm given a different flavor on that. So the answer is, mathematician will say is 4. If you ask a statistician, right, what is 2 plus 2, it is most likely, most probable, it is 4. But if you ask an accountant, right, his answer is, you tell me what you want. Okay. Now you ask the same question to a like AI expert, right? Okay. So his answer will be based on what model this his AI model was trained on. Okay, what LLM was used. Okay, so if the model was trained on mathematics, so the answer is come 4. If you ask what is trained on the data set, from the statistician, like it will become most likely whatever it is, right? So I think that's the biggest risk that we see, people using the AI model. And this is a known fact, okay, and you can test it anytime. If you ask any AI expert, okay, can you justify your answer here, whatever the answer it is coming, I can tell you 8 out of 10 times they can't explain. That's the biggest risk that I see it, right? So from our perspective, which model the data model has been trained on, okay, I think that gets very important. The second thing is, this is a real life example here. One of the big carrier, I won't say the name, okay, they got sued by a group of people out of Chicago. I'm giving some clue anyway. And the problem was, it was regarding the company that built the fraud model. They use underwriting data there. So unknowingly, people can use some data which they're not supposed to use it. And this big carrier got sued for that reason alone. And so the company which built the model underneath. So these are some of the unintended, risks can happen, which people will eventually find out. As you said, the place is still evolving. And, one day we'll be able to put enough guardrails, to avoid this kind of incidents here.
Understand. Oh, sorry, go ahead,
Oh,
Matthew.
so, yeah, I was going to go. My mind came back. So I was going to say, it reminded me of there was a famous court case where some guy had been using ChatGPT and coming up with cases to like support his particular case, and he presented them to the judge, and the judge was like, wow, these are like really specific cases. And then it turned out that they'd all been made up by ChatGPT and none of them actually existed. So, the hallucinations that these models produce, actually, I think Geoffrey Hinton calls them confabulations, because it's kind of like, if you think of a kid in school and they don't know the answer, they'll just make something up. That's kind of how it feels like when you're talking to ChatGPT. It makes it sound fairly assertive. And so, like you did, where you were like, wow, I believe this because it's saying, like, why would it lie to me? That's like a bit of a dangerous risk there. And then I would also say one aspect that I've noticed in insurance is there's like a talent acquisition issue, which is, that not many PhDs like in AI go into the insurance industry, candidly. Most of them go into finance or big tech. And so I think there's a risk there in terms of just getting left behind, basically. Because you have, let's say you have all these real-time systems in place for like hedge funds and things, and then you have insurance firms, and there's like suddenly a hurricane, and you don't have a moratorium on buying insurance, and then you have some hedge fund that does, goes and does a bunch of stuff, and you don't really respond quickly enough. If everyone else is using this, you have to also be at that level in order to defend against it to some extent, or be able to manage those risks accordingly.
Sanjeev's point about needing to understand the limitations of a particular model is so important. We hear all the time the mantra of having a human in the loop as sort of a safety mechanism with respect to your use of AI. Having a human in the loop is a really good idea, but it has to be the right human. It can't just be anybody, right? It has to be somebody who understands what the AI can do, but also has to understand what the limitations of that particular model are as well. Because otherwise, you might as well, have my mom in the chair, and that would not be ideal. The other thing, too, in terms of specific risks, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, came out a few months ago with a piece on generative AI, and it identified, it was close to 20 distinct risks that are associated with the use of generative AI, including many that we've talked about, but others that we haven't, like the potential that the human interacting with the generative AI might develop feelings for the generative AI and lead to all kinds of bad results. In fact, there was a story, I think, in USA Today today, or maybe yesterday, it was a tragic story about a kid,
Suicide,
Exactly, because he had been interacting with an AI chatbot that had assumed the role of somebody. Oh, Daenerys from Game of Thrones, right? And so anyway, there are all kinds of things that could go wrong, and we're just sort of scratching the surface in terms of understanding it.
No, I think that story kind of choke you if you haven't seen it. It's yeah. So we're gonna do some predictions, and we'll have probably 10 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, start thinking about those. So Scott, you know how I love a good prediction. So looking out ahead, maybe like 5, 10 years, what do you think AI will really do to help transform the industry? And if you've got maybe even a specific idea or something that would happen, go ahead and share it. But I'd love to hear your predictions, and I'll start with you, Scott, because you know I love predictions too.
Everyone should know that Nick is like the oracle. He is the best at predictions. So asking anyone else is kind of laughable, but we'll try. So I think there are some amazing things that are going to happen in connection with AI outside the insurance space that will have a direct impact on insurers. Think about medicine, or just healthcare generally, and the amazing advances we're already seeing thanks to AI, and will continue to see how that's going to have an impact on morbidity and mortality and all the risk that insurers take on. So that's sort of low-hanging fruit. I think AI may allow insurers to better not just measure risk that they're taking on, but better manage the risk in connection with their policyholders. And so that could be an offering. Not only are we going to take on risk by virtue of the policy we issue, but we're going to help you manage the risk, help you get healthier, or help your plant stay in service or whatever. I think here's another one. I think that in the not too distant future, AI will have a direct impact on the sales process. So you'll still meet with an agent, but the AI will be listening in real time to the conversation that the agent is having with the applicant and make suggestions in real time. Not to like override what the agent would otherwise recommend, but almost like an R2-D2 unit for Luke Skywalker. Just sort of saying, hey, you might want to think about X.
Anything you want to add, Matthew?
I'm still thinking about it, actually. Can you
All
get
right,
it?
Sanjeev, go
I
ahead.
can go. Okay. So, my guess, at least couple of places where I would say, like for example, the policy serving, right? It's like, I think probably the cost of policy serving might come as close to zero as possible, because all the agents that you have it, right? They might be able to, go through all scenarios and come up with some answers there. So your only cost will be the virtual agent cost, So that probably, I would say, the price might go down here. And the second thing, which is very close to us anyway, we feel the claim settlement part of it will go as less as human involved. Okay, so because all the things are defined, people should be able to take a decision, or the bot should be able to take a decision of the claim settlement part of it. I think these are the two main things which I would say.
Yeah, so I'd say, I don't know, just thinking of like personalized medicine, like you said, I think I see that happening as well in insurance, where you're bundling a bunch of different things together, and you maybe can also have like a pay-as-you-go model. And I'm thinking as well, so there's a process that was developed for triage, basically, which you basically look at what doctors are doing, like the actions they take, but you don't necessarily know what reward function the doctor is modeling. And there's ways of reverse engineering that so you can work out the reward function that the doctor or surgeon is following. And then I'm imagining you could do the same thing for underwriting or some other aspects of insurance, and then reapply that to any other domain where you maybe even don't have data. So at that point, I see you don't really need to have underwriting as a discipline. I don't know if that will happen in 10 years. I think it would be a very bespoke set of like a discipline at that point. And I could also see that happening in claims as well. So yeah, that might correspond with a lot of job losses.
Yeah.
But also this is just a prediction.
All right. Well, we have about 10 minutes for questions. If anybody has a question, it looks like Chris has one, right?
Sorry, Chris Draper here in Des Moines. EU AI Act, where do you think they got it right, where they got it wrong? And if we were to adopt that same regulatory strategy, how would that impact the insurance industry?
That is a big question. Well, one thing that they got right is that they are purporting to take a risk-based approach. So, they have a certain strata of use cases that they say, too dangerous, we're simply going to prohibit it outright. Then the next tier down would be what they deem to be high-risk use cases. And for those, we're saying, all right, we're not going to ban them, but we're going to put a lot of guardrails around the use, and we're going to require you to, basically manage the heck out of it to try to avoid negative outcomes. And then, the next tier down, the minimal risk, it's much more about transparency and sort of disclosure. So hard to argue with that sort of stratification. You can certainly argue about how they rank specific use cases, and I suppose you could argue about some of the things that they're requiring you to do with respect to high use cases, but at a very high level, hard to argue with the approach. Now, the U.S. tends to be loath to adopt verbatim what they do in the EU, so I don't see that translating perfectly to what we do in the U.S. And part of the executive order that Biden signed almost exactly a year ago was about maintaining U.S. leadership, not just in terms of the technology, but in terms of setting standards. So we're probably going to go our own way.
Any other questions? Oh, there's one up.
Hi, thank you guys. I'm just wondering, and you kind of touched on this already, but as technology becomes increasingly more complex, how do you really structure the oversight and governance to ensure the appropriate accountability by process owners in the business? You did mention the human insertion of a human, understanding the limitations of the model, but I'm wondering if you could expand upon that a bit.
That's a really good question. So whether you're talking about the NEIC bulletin or Colorado or New York or whatever other guidance out there, they all zero in on that accountability thing. And, they don't get very granular, but they essentially say, we got to know, who's on first. We have to know either by name or by title who owns this model, who owns the monitoring of this model, who's in charge of testing the model, so that things don't slip through the cracks. I think that's easier said than done, and a lot of the companies that we're working with are still early enough in their governance journey that they haven't gotten to that part, but that has to be part of it.
All right. And, Kevin.
Thank you. When you think of developing and implementing an AI model, whether it be in underwriting or in claims or fraud, et cetera, what are some of the high-level steps you go through to make sure you're getting the outcomes that you're looking for? How do you implement this thing, and how long does it take?
Well, I'd say the biggest challenge is, ironically, I just gave a lecture on this morning to some of the Drake students, but I'd say the biggest challenge is just based on the NAIC principles are, there's like fairness and ethical use. So you have to ensure that the algorithm's not discriminating, and you have equitable outcomes between groups. But I highlighted to the students that there's at least 26 mathematical definitions of fairness, and depending on which one you use, you can both prove that an algorithm is and is not discriminating. And this was a problem with the COMPAS algorithm that was used to predict recidivism in 2016, and there was a whole investigative journalist investigation that went on to related to this. So fairness is like a bit of a problem, and also when you think about the equitable outcomes, you get into a weird situation. So for a good example is trying to predict breast cancer, for example. If you actually algorithms are generally better at predicting breast cancer within white women than in black women, and this is it's more prevalent in the black population, the white population, and the data sets publicly just have a higher prevalence of white women in them. So this means that, what are you going to do to make the equitable outcomes? Are you going to reduce the accuracy of the algorithm on white women? Because that doesn't necessarily correspond to, it's fair, but it's maybe not the most ethical thing to do. So there's a disparity there between the fairness and ethics criteria. And it's not clear what the appropriate way to manage that is. And then there's also the interpretability aspect, so using algorithms that you're able to explain the decisions. So when you have GDPR, there's a right to explanation. So if someone comes to you and asks for a loan and you deny them, you have to be able to explain, oh, I did it because of XYZ. And obviously that XYZ also has to not discriminate. It can't say, oh, Matt's from England and we don't like English people, so we're not going to give him a loan. So yes, this is one reason why I'm like reluctant to work with deep neural networks and language models, because it's difficult to explain those behaviors. For language models explicitly so, because you have this extremely large context length mixed in with 1 trillion parameters, and it's hard enough to understand what's going on in a parameterization of like 1,000 parameters, let alone 1 trillion. So that's something like using simpler algorithms, or the way that we get around it is we have this rule-based system, which is unwindable to a regulator. And then we have an AI loop, which is augmented with third-party data, and this helps us update the rules. So we say, this rule is not being used, or this rule is triggered a lot, but this underwriter does not use this rule, and he generally does better, so maybe we should remove this rule. And so that's how we get through that criteria. And then there's also model drift, which is like the other hard issue, but I've been talking for too long, so.
I know. The couple of things which I will add to what was already said here. I think the biggest challenge happens in any of this AI model is the data part of it. Believe it or not, 85% of the time goes for the plumbing of the data itself. If you didn't collect the right data, you can be sure that you will not get your destination there. The second thing is, and when you're making the models, right? Obviously, you can make it as complex as it can be, but the attributes that you use for the selection of the model, I think that makes a big impact too. Now, I think how long it takes, it also depends on, how much accuracy you want it, and what's the volume of the data that we are talking about. So it's tough, but I said, 80-85% of the time goes towards plumbing of the data itself. Yeah. Modeling becomes much easier once you have the good data there. Yeah. Would you agree on that?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
All right, last question, Chris. Go ahead.
Anthropic's Claude is sort of owning the marketing space on safety in AI, really, right? With its constitutional AI, which basically is an automated bias checker, right? How do you, each of you as developers, how do you define safety, and when do you know you've achieved it?
I don't even know what to say.
I think that's more theoretical question. I'll let you have it.
Yeah, safe AI is a whole can of worms. Honestly, I don't know how to answer this question in a way that's meaningful. Maybe we should talk about this afterwards.
I know. No, this is, and as I said, it's not very easy to describe it. Okay, but I'm sure there will be some solution someday.
Well, let's give the panelists a round of applause.
Thank you all very, very much to our panelists, to our steering group members, to those of you in attendance today. We greatly, greatly appreciate your support of the Drake Risk and Opportunity Forum. It is interesting to me that when I look at the steering group and those speaking on stage today, 8 of the 27 people are Drake University alumni. And so it shows you the embedded nature of managing risk, identifying risk, mitigating risk. All these things are where people from this university find themselves throughout their career. So on behalf of Drake University, I'd like to thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next year. Videos from today's event will be posted soon on the event's website and also on our YouTube channel. So I look forward to checking those out, and you can pick up on anything that you missed throughout today. Thank you.